Can you all hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. It's really a pleasure to be with you. What I want to do this morning is share with you some work that's in process right now on a variant in Ephesians chapter 5. And then what I'd like to do is tease out some implications for that at the end. So as you may know, as I certainly know, textual criticism is not most people's favorite subject. It was R.C.P. Hansen who famously was quoted as saying, "I look upon the textual critic as I look upon the man who comes to clean the drains. I should not like to do it myself, but I am very glad that someone likes to do it." So taking that as my starting point this morning, I've set myself the task of trying to convince you that even if textual criticism is a drudgery, it is a drudgery well worth doing. And to make that seemingly impossible case, I want to look with you this morning at a neglected variant in Ephesians chapter 5, show you why I think commentators are almost universally wrong about it, and then draw some implications from that. Okay, so if you have a Greek New Testament with you, we're going to be looking at Ephesians 5 verses 21 and 22 in particular, so you may want to open that up. I've given you a handout, so I've put the readings on the handout so you have them there if you don't have a New Testament with you. The variant I have in mind is found in Ephesians chapter 5, verse 22, and its importance lies in the fact that it sits at the start of the Ephesian household code, or so I will try to show. The reason I will show this is that the question of where exactly the household code starts is a matter of widespread disagreement among commentators, editors of the Greek New Testament, and as well as translators of the Bible. Many have noted what Frank Thielman calls the transitional messiness at the start of the code. Does it start in verse 21 or does it start in verse 22? Does verse 21 go with what precedes or does it go with what follows and introduce it? The issue can be seen even in English translations by noting where they set the paragraph break. So the ESV, for example, starts a new paragraph at verse 22, but the RSV, which is the basis for the ESV, starts it at verse 21. The NIV shows even more uncertainty. In the older NIV 1984, the translators put a paragraph break at both 521 and at 522, but they put the heading over 522 and following. In the newer NIV 2011, they have kept both paragraph breaks, but now placed the heading over 521 and following. And so there's the issue right there. You can see it just by looking at your translations. Your Nestle-Aland 28 places a break before 521, but it notes the problem of punctuation in the rarely used punctuation apparatus. So if you actually look at your apparatus of your Nestle-Aland 28, you will note that they mark a choice that needs to be made as to where to put the full stop. Do you put the full stop after verse 21 or before it? And that essentially is the issue of how to paragraph it, how to break up the text at this point. Now, the issue behind this is a syntactical one. The participle in verse 21, hupotassimenoi, reads naturally with the preceding participles that all depend on the command to be filled with the Holy Spirit in verse 18. The problem is that verse 22 in your Nestle-Aland text has no main verb. And so for many interpreters, this lack of a verb in verse 22 proves that verse 21 must be read very closely with what follows rather than with what precedes. So Heinrich Grieven speaks for many when he describes 521 as, quote, the common heading for the entire household code, and says that this is the case because the implied imperative in verse 22 has to be derived from verse 21. T.K. Abbott in his ICC commentary notes the same, and I could cite others, but I won't for sake of time. However, if there is an explicit imperative in verse 22, as many previous interpreters often did see, then 521 is easily read with the participles in verses 19 through 20, and that leaves 522 as the natural start of the household code. Now, this is not merely a matter of paragraphing that has no implications for interpretations. Rather, the decision can be quite important and is quite important for many interpreters because of the apparent conflict between the mutual or symmetrical submission that's required in 521 and the non-mutual or asymmetrical submission that appears to be commanded of the wife to the husband in 522 and following. So to illustrate this, Marcus Bart, in his well-known commentary, argues that neglecting, quote, the dominant position of verse 22 over the household code silences the unique message of Ephesians, which he says that unique message is one that challenges, quote, the conservative and patriarchal concepts of social order, which have often been attributed to Paul or derived from his teaching. Similarly, J. Paul Sampley, in his influential monograph on the household code in Ephesians, calls verse 21, quote, a general introduction to the entire household code form, and therefore a rubric under which all of 522 through 6:9 is to be interpreted. So for Sampley, verse 21 is actually a way that the author of Ephesians critiques the basic stance of the household code form, and in that way he Christianizes it. Likewise, John Muddiman says verse 21 reveals where the writer's real interest lies. In other words, for many readers, placing 521 as a heading over the household code provides the interpretive key for it, and more specifically makes mutual submission the guiding principle of everything that follows. What is interesting is that a survey of commentaries for the last 100, and really I've started to look at about 150 years or so, shows substantial agreement on the text critical issue in 522, and at the same time shows substantial disagreement on the question of how to break the text. So commentators almost universally agree on the text of 521, but they remain divided on how to break it, and thus how to read 521 in relation to its context. So what I want to do with the rest of our time then is re-look at the text critical problem, and I want to argue for a neglected reading that I think will solve not only the textual problem, but also the paragraphing and interpretive problem as well. So if we turn to the textual problem, you can see the evidence there on your handout, and I've given you 5 readings there, only 3 of which are recorded in your Nestle Aland or your UBS edition. The other 2 readings I've gotten from some larger editions that include a lot more data. And for the sake of time, I'm going to go ahead and skip a discussion of reading B and C because they're fairly easy to explain through transcriptional explanations. So really what we're dealing with is reading A, reading B, and reading E. Okay, and reading E is what you'll find in your Nestle Aland edition or your UBS or your SBL if you use one of those. As noted, there is near universal agreement among commentators and editors that the shorter reading, or reading E on your handout, is the original. And I'm just going to jump right away to the arguments for this reading. I'm not going to give you too many examples. I just want to jump to the arguments for time. The most commonly cited readings are the following 6, and these also are on your handout. The first one is that the shorter reading is attested by early and important manuscripts. The second is that the absence of the verb would have been uncomfortable to scribes who felt a need to fill in the gap. The third, and closely related, is that the verb could have been added in the lectionary system for the sake of public reading. If you start the reading at verse 22, you need a verb there because you don't have the immediate context. The fourth argument is that there is variation in position and form in the longer readings, and those are noted in the manuscripts that are in parentheses in your handout. And oftentimes textual critics think that movement of a phrase or of a text can indicate that it's not original, that it's been added secondarily, and that's why it moves around. Another argument in favor of the shorter reading is that it is in keeping with Paul or the author's succinct style. And then lastly, in my opinion, the strongest argument is that there is a lack of convincing explanation for the verb's omission. In other words, it's simply that how do we explain the origin of the shorter reading if it's not original? And since we can't find an explanation for it, then the simplest explanation is that it's the original reading and that the others all derived from it. Okay? Most of these reasons are given in Metzger's popular textual commentary, and a great many commentaries, as they often do, follow his judgment. Several of these reasons can actually be traced all the way back to Erasmus, who, after noting the omission of the verb in Jerome's manuscript, concludes in his annotations of the New Testament that, quote, the verb is found today in Greek manuscripts, added, he says, as it appears, to make the sense clearer and to read the clause independently as the case requires. In other words, he's basically giving a lectionary explanation, saying when this text is read independently of its immediate context, you need a verb, and that's why it was added. So all the way back to Erasmus, some people have thought the shorter reading is original. I only know of 2 modern editions that reject the shorter reading as original, and you can see these on the second page of your handout. Okay, the dash represents the omission. So you can see that most editions since 1865 and with Tischendorf have preferred the shorter reading. Before that, most editions are just following the Textus Receptus, so they're not really critical editions, so it's not that surprising that they all have the second person plural imperative there. Okay. So I only know of 2 modern editions that reject the shorter reading, and I know of no major commentators in the last 150 years that do. Every commentator I've looked at over the last 150 years has preferred the shorter reading. The only exception is Harold Hoehner in his commentary, who he's torn. He prints the second person plural imperative in brackets and says it's a really tough decision to make. But other than that, every commentator I've looked at prefers the shorter reading, and for one or more of the 6 reasons that I've just given you. Okay, so what I want to do now is explain what I think are the flaws in all 6 of those reasons. Okay, and I'm just going to go through these one at a time. First, there is no denying that P46 and Vaticanus, which are the two Greek manuscripts that attest the shorter reading, the only 2, by the way, they are both old and very important witnesses. There is no denying that, in my opinion. And we can add to this the fact that Jerome, in his commentary in the 4th century, notes that he is aware that the verb is present in Latin, but that his Greek codices do not have the verb. And since it's unlikely that Jerome is using either P46 or Codex Vaticanus, or at least I don't think he was, he must know of other Greek manuscripts that we no longer are aware of. Okay, and they must be at least as old as the 4th century, since that's when he's writing. Okay, so there's no denying that this shorter reading does have early and important support. Okay. However, we should note that there are equally or near equally early witnesses that support both of the other longer readings. So we can see this in Codex Sinaiticus, Codex Alexandrinus, the Old Latin, Origen, Ambrosiaster, have the third person plural imperative, hupotas estoson. And that 06, several Old Latins, and Chrysostom have the second person plural imperative. So thus the age of the witnesses is not really in any special favor of the shorter reading, because really all 3 of these readings are attested quite early. And in the case of the third person imperative, they're attested in some very important manuscripts as well, in 01 and 02, and even for the second person, 06 is quite important as well, in my opinion. So let's deal with the second argument then. There can be no doubt in my mind at this point as well that scribes would have felt an awkwardness of having no verb in verse 22, and so would have supplied one where they did not find one. But here we should ask, what would they most likely have supplied at this point? And it's my opinion that the third person imperative is highly unlikely as something that scribes would have supplied. In the context of the household code in Ephesians, all of the imperatives are second person plural to introduce new addressees. So when husbands are addressed, when slaves are addressed, when fathers and masters, it's always a second person plural imperative used to address them. If we expand to Ephesians as a whole, we note that Paul uses a second person plural imperative 30 times and never uses a third person plural imperative. And then looking at the Pauline corpus as a whole, he uses the second person plural imperative 218 times and only uses the third person 18 times. In short, the shorter reading readily explains the origin of a second person plural imperative, but in my opinion has a very difficult time explaining why any scribe would fill the gap with a third person plural imperative. And in fact, we find that third person imperative in a great many witnesses. And so it's quite surprising in my view. I could also note at this point that in Colossians, in the parallel passage in Colossians, Paul uses the very same second person plural imperative, hupotas esthe. And to my knowledge, we don't find the third person imperative in any manuscripts at that point. So moving to the third argument then, the appeal to the lectionary system as the origin of the longer reading, I think faces the same issue. We might expect scribes to fill that gap for the sake of the lectionary, but we would expect them to fill it with a second person imperative, not a third person. And then the other issue with this is I'm still working on the lectionary system myself, but the evidence I'm aware of does not show that a new lection, a new reading, starts at verse 22. And then the other issue here is our earliest lectionary manuscripts are from the 7th century and later. So in my opinion, this is a pretty weak argument in favor of the shorter reading. So moving on to the fourth argument, this is an argument about the variation in word order, that because the longer readings move around in a handful of manuscripts, that suggests that they are secondary. However, transpositions of word order are extremely common in our manuscripts. They happen on every page of your Greek New Testament. And in fact, probably in every verse if you use a bigger apparatus than your Nestle. And no one would suggest that anytime there's a transposition of words, that suggests that those words are left out originally. If we did that, we would soon have no text of the New Testament left. So I'm not convinced that mere transposition of the verb in a few manuscripts is evidence that the shorter reading is original and the longer has been added. Fifth, I suppose that some will find the stylistic argument that Paul is succinct and that the shorter reading is more succinct. They may find that convincing, but I do not. As already noted, every other addressee in the household code is addressed with an explicit imperative verb. So if anything, the style at this point in Paul's argument leads us to accept the shorter reading as less likely to be original on the author's style. Now, finally, I want to deal with the last argument, the sixth one. In my opinion, as I said, this is by far the strongest argument in favor of the shorter reading. Okay? It is the argument that if the shorter reading is not original, how in the world can we explain its origin? Why would any scribe want to remove a verb if they found that in their manuscript? And I agree that no scribe would want to do that. There's no reason. However, I do think that precisely at this point, there is an easy but neglected explanation for it. To see it, we need to read the text with the third person imperative and not with the second. And when we do, we find immediately that the preceding word before the verb ends in the exact same letter as the third person imperative. They both end in the letter nu. So the word right before it is andrasine. That ends in a nu, and that's not a movable nu there. So it ends in a nu, and therefore lends itself to a very common type of omission known as parablepsis, or in this case, more specifically, homoiotoluton. That is an omission that's due to the same letters that end two words, and you accidentally leave out what's in between. So the scribe of B and P46, or perhaps their shared ancestor, could have easily written andrasine into their copy and then turn back to their exemplar only to rest their eye not on the noon of andrasine, but rather on the noon of hupatasesthosan, and thus left it out entirely. In fact, this exact same mistake can be found just a few verses earlier in these same two manuscripts in Ephesians verse 19, and this variant is noted in your Nestle apparatus. There, both of these two same witnesses have left out the word pneumatikais, either because it ends with the same three letters as hodais right before it, or possibly because the word after it also ends in a sigma. To my knowledge, no one thinks that this shorter reading in P46 and B is original. There are also other clear places in P46 where the scribe has accidentally omitted text because of only one letter shared in common with the word before it. These are in Philippians 3, Hebrews 8, and 1 Corinthians 8. And I'm going through the data right now of Vaticanus because I am quite certain that the scribe made that same mistake as well. But I'm still looking, just haven't gotten around to it. So clearly this same mistake happens in both these manuscripts. In short, I think the reading that best explains the rise of the other variants in 522 is not actually the shorter reading. It's the third person plural imperative, hupatasesthosan. It can easily explain the omission through the common mechanical error of parablepsis, and it can also explain the change to hupatasestha as a harmonization to the rest of the household code, where the second person imperative occur with each and every new addressee. And as I mentioned, it could also be a harmonization to Colossians 3, verse 18, where we find the second person imperative plural again. And there it's in the reference, of course, to wives and husbands as well. Finally, given the infrequency of Paul's use of the third person plural imperative as a whole, I think hupatasesthosan here turns out to be what we call the lectio difficilior, that is, the more difficult reading. And thus, it is the reading least likely to be the creation of scribes. And so the best explanation for it is that it is not a creation of scribes, but rather it's the creation of the author, of Paul himself. Now, the implication for this interpretation of the textual problem is that 521 should clearly be read with what precedes and not with what follows, or at least it should be read more with what precedes than with what follows. If 522 does have an explicit verb, then the participle of 521 easily and naturally reads with the other participles as various ways to be filled with the Holy Spirit. With a turn toward wives and the use of an explicit imperative in 522, we have the actual start of the Ephesian household code. 521 cannot then be read as a general heading, nor as some kind of overarching interpretive key for the code that follows. Still less can it be used to undermine or qualify the commands that follow. Instead, verse 22 and following should be read as the specific submission that Paul has in mind in verse 21, and thus, and there are other reasons to think this as well, but then the submission that follows in 522 and following is probably not symmetrical or mutual, but rather 521 means something like submit one to another, not submit every one of you to everyone else of you, something like that. Okay, there's a lot more we could say about that, but for the sake of time, I won't say more about that unless you want to ask about it. Okay. Now, what I want to do from here then is, if I'm right about this variant, what I want to do is draw some lessons for you, okay, or some applications. Okay. Now, I'm not a good Baptist, so I have 5 instead of 3 points. All right, but we'll do these quickly. Okay. The first is, do not assume that all text critical work has been done. The Nestle-Aland editors are clear to say in their edition that it is a working text, and it should not be accepted as the correct or de facto text. Nor should we assume, as New Testament scholars, that it must be right because its editors are better text critics than we are, okay? Although I submit that in some cases they may be, okay? But they are humans as well. They have blind spots. They make mistakes. They overlook evidence. As Martin West, the classicist, says, editors are not always people who can be trusted. Now, I like the editors of the Nestle, don't get me wrong, okay? I like them quite a lot, but they're not always right. And West goes on to say that we should be prepared as readers, as interpreters, to consider the facts presented in the apparatus and exercise our own judgment on them. And he says we must do so in places where the text is important to us for some further purpose. And so I would just commend that to you. Second is, don't be afraid to challenge a consensus. Too many commentators, in my opinion, simply parrot Bruce Metzger's textual commentary, or worse, they parrot commentators who came before them who have parroted Bruce Metzger. Okay, I tell my text critic students, I say, read the commentators for help on text criticism, but realize most of the time they will not say anything different than Bruce Metzger. So I love commentators, don't get me wrong, but they tend to be better trained in other areas. Many commentators have never spent serious time with the New Testament manuscript, and their knowledge of the mechanics of scribal work is often secondhand. So again, do not be afraid to challenge the consensus. Some of my friends are bothered that no commentators agree with me at this point, and if it was a matter of interpretation, you know, on something larger, I might be bothered by that, but on textual criticism, I don't find it so difficult to go against the commentator's consensus. Third, even the best manuscripts have mistakes. The temptation of external evidence is that it seems more objective to us. And when in doubt on the internal evidence, it is often reassuring or easiest to fall back on the earliest and best manuscripts, whatever we think those are. But even the earliest and best manuscripts have many mistakes. And I think one of the reasons why we only think that they don't is because we may be familiar with them only from our apparatus. If you spend time with them going through them, you'll find that they too are full of mistakes. Some are, of course, better than others, but every manuscript has mistakes. All right. So there are plenty. There is no reason to think then that P46 and B, for example, are infallible, even though I actually think they are very, very good manuscripts overall. They're not infallible. No manuscript or group of manuscripts is, and none should be so sacrosanct in our text critical work that we're not willing to go against them. Fourth, not all variants are insignificant. This is kind of touching on a larger issue, but I think it's worth mentioning here. I think it is a good and important apologetic point to make that the vast majority of our variants do not affect the meaning of the New Testament and therefore do not affect Christian doctrine or practice. But this variant, I think, is a clear example of how some, admittedly very few, textual variants can and do have a bearing on our practice as Christians. The lack of a verb in Ephesians 5:22 is regularly cited in evangelical debates about the nature of the husband's headship over the wife and the wife's submission to her husband. You cannot read in the debates on egalitarianism and complementarianism very far without running into this particular variant. It is almost always used to, the omission of the verb, okay, so the text of the Nestle-Aland that I'm arguing against here, is almost always used to clinch the argument that Paul commands mutual submission in marriage rather than unilateral submission. In other words, the textual decision has pretty direct bearing for many on the very practical question of how spouses should relate to one another in Christian marriage. And then lastly, and finally, textual criticism is necessary to engage in. Now, of course, I would say that as a text critic, right? Okay. But hopefully through this variant, you've seen why. It cannot simply be left to the experts, nor can it be set aside as a completed project as if there's nothing left to do. So my final exhortation to you is you too can correct the Nestle Alond. All right. And I encourage you to do so. Thank you. That's the end of the presentation. I'll be happy to entertain questions you have about it.
Good. Thanks so much for the clarity of that. I don't know if you'll be doing this in other scenarios or something, but one thing I might offer as a suggestion on the handout is to then just to give us the text with the variant you're suggesting in it, so we can see it. That would be really helpful.
Okay.
So just to clarify, so are you suggesting that it's in verse 22, "Hai gunukais tois iois andrasin," and then is that where you're saying the dosan would be?
Correct, and that's where it's noted in your Nestle apparatus. So if you have your apparatus, you see the little T symbol there. Yeah, and so that does move around in one or two manuscripts, but that's pretty much the place you find it in the vast majority of witnesses that have the third person imperative.
So let me ask you a question about that, and maybe I missed your comment. Are you saying then part of the strength of that reading would also be that it parallels that when you get down to 25, you also have a verb stated, and then where's the next one? Let's see.
So then the next one should be 6:1. You see a second person imperative there, hubakuete, right?
Okay. So if I heard you correctly, part of your argument was that each of the constituent members in the Hausstoffel here are given a verb, basically.
Correct. Exactly. Yep. So in fact, if we don't have a verb in verse 22, that's the odd one out. That's the only addressee that doesn't have an explicit verb.
Sure. Okay. Right. So I understand the strength of that. It doesn't though quite end up being a parallel though, right? Because so you would be reading 22 to be saying, let wives be submissive to their own husbands in the Lord, right?
Correct. Yeah. So it's a third person.
But that's direct. 25 doesn't really provide a nice parallel to that then, because the hoi on dress.
That's right. No, that's right. That's right. And that's actually the strength, I think, of it, right? It's a parallel in that it has an explicit imperative, but it's not an exact parallel. The exact parallel is precisely what we'd expect scribes to change the text to, right? So if the shorter reading is original, how in the world do we ever get a third person imperative there in any manuscript, right? No scribe would naturally put in a third person imperative there. We all feel the awkwardness of it, right? And that's exactly the awkwardness that a scribe would feel. So if a scribe is going to change that third person imperative to something else, what are they going to change it to? They're going to change it to a second person imperative, right? The other thing I'd note, though, is that in verse 24, you do have a third person verb, right? But likewise, as the church submits to Christ, so also wives. And then we don't have an explicit verb in the 24, an imperative there. So also wives to the husbands in everything, right? So the third person imperative there actually works well with verse 24. And then it's in verse 25 that Paul switches to the direct address.
It seems like I understand what you're saying, but it seems like a stronger argument would be, though, that if there was a second person that paralleled the three, because it is an exact parallel then, right?
No, that's right. No, it's exactly right.
And first, you got a second person imperative in 25 and in 6:1. It seems like the stronger version of your argument, which you're not able to make, would be that there's a second person in our manuscripts, but you're saying the third person would be the more difficult reading. But
correct.
But there's not that. That's not attested at all. It's either. Is that correct?
No, there is a second person plural imperative, right? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah.
There is. That's reading. Sorry, what is it on your handout? That's reading D on your handout, and you can see that's actually the majority text reading, right? So that's the dominant reading in the manuscripts.
Yeah. Okay, that's helpful.
Yeah.
So
exactly.
That's the strength of your argument, to say that. Okay, but what we read in our text usually is omitting it has nothing there.
Correct.
Majority is the second. Got it. Okay.
Correct. Yep, exactly. So what I'm trying to say is the third person imperative verb actually explains all the other readings the best. By far, in my opinion, right? So if the original text is no verb, I can easily understand how you go from no verb to a second person imperative. I can't explain how you go from no verb to a third person imperative.
Yeah.
That's super weird, right?
Right.
And makes very little sense, in my opinion, of Paul's style and of the rest of the household code, right? And again, you've got the parallel in Colossians chapter 3, where sure enough, it's a second person plural imperative, the exact same verb you find in the majority text here, which is hupotaseste, right?
Okay, so sorry, I understand that helps.
Yeah, sorry, that wasn't clear.
Just one other observation. I think your third lesson just makes so much sense that I don't think I've ever just articulated it or heard it articulated, that even the best manuscripts have mistakes. Like we tend to give them, I think most of us are second-handers when it comes to textual criticism for sure. And we tend to think, that external evidence is, you look at the earliest ones, not in isolation, but if it's the earliest, therefore it's stronger. But in any particular instance, the earliest one could not be better. That's just good.
And if we went through P46 and B, I gave you 3 examples in P46 where the scribe makes this exact type of error, where it's only one letter shared in common. If I expanded that to show you all the places where P46 makes a mistake, where there's more than one letter in common and he leaves out words as a result, I'd have another dozen examples or more, right? So and same with Vaticanus.
It's the problem with stats of any sort, right? I mean, that in any given instance, this could be the exception to the stat, right? And so
correct. And my point is not to say that P46 and B can't be original because they make this mistake elsewhere. It's rather to say they certainly can be wrong here because they make the same mistake elsewhere, right? It's kind of to dislodge the assumption that, well, because it's B and P46, they must be right or they can't be wrong, right? And I want to say, of course they can be wrong, right?
Okay, that's helpful. Yeah. Thanks. Let's just open it up. Any questions at any level which you want to ask?
Yeah. Thanks, Dr. Gurry.
Hey,
Matt Albany is here. I have a short question, then one that's a little more detailed on against your arguments. But you'll see. How do the manuscripts organize the paragraph markers?
Yes.
21, 22. How does the Tyndale House version?
Yes, great question. Okay, so this is really interesting, and I'm still working on this data, so that in the sake of time is why I left this out. All the manuscripts that I have looked at so far, these Greek manuscripts, I may not get into versions for the particular paragraphing, but all the Greek manuscripts that have paragraphing, if they put a paragraph here, they put it at verse 22 and none put it at verse 21. Okay. So this is really interesting, even in Vaticanus, right, which has no verb in verse 22, okay, because it has the omission, there's still a paragraph break at 522 and not at 521.
Great.
So the Tyndale House edition, rightly in my view, has a third person imperative as their preferred reading, and rightly in my view has a paragraph break at 522. And if you look at your handout, you'll see most editions have a paragraph break at 522 up until 1975. And that's the first one I've found in the UBS 3 where they decide to put a paragraph break at 521 instead of 522, okay? So even Westcott and Hort, even the Nestle first edition, even Sauter, for example, or Tischendorf, who don't have a verb at this point, they still sort of intuit, no, the paragraph break belongs at 522. But since 1975, you can see there's a notable tendency to put the break at 521.
Before you go on, let me ask on that. Even manuscripts that have Kephaloi or other kind of titles, do any of them have any kind of heading there?
I think if I remember right, and I need to look at it more closely, but my sense is that the Kephalai are for the larger section. So Kephalai tend to be for much larger sections than just a paragraph. So I think there's maybe like 5 Kephalai total for Ephesians, and I think this one comes at something like 5:1, and then covers 5:1 through 6 something. Yeah.
And then I was wondering if you could clarify objection number 5. The shorter reading is in keeping with Paul's succinct style.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm misunderstanding this, but I don't think Paul has a succinct style all the time. There are times when it's succinct, and there are times when it's verbose. Like in Ephesians 1 is not succinct at all. So maybe
totally, right? No, totally. Yeah.
It just seems like a really
Yeah.
point that people are making. I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, here's the thing. So I'm totally agreeing with you, Matt, on that. So I don't think, his succinct style is at all an argument for the shorter reading at this point. I've only ever seen people just cite that offhand. I've never seen any kind of defense of that. So it's kind of one of those things where it seems like the commentators have read Metzger, and Metzger gives that as one kind of further piece of evidence, and so they cite that as well. But I've never seen anybody kind of develop that really at length. So to me, in some ways, that's in the eye of the beholder. Again, if we want to take style into consideration, which I think we should, the style in the household code in Ephesians is clearly that every other addressee gets their own verb, right? So,
and that's still succinct.
And that, yeah. And that's still pretty succinct. Yeah, sure. I mean, yeah.
We'll just beat the horse over and over again.
Yeah. Right.
No, thank you.
Yep.
Dr. Gurry, Rob Plummer here. Just a quick question or observation. I wonder if it wouldn't further strengthen your argument to be able to say this is using a third person plural would actually be a Pauline stylistic pattern. If you look, I just glanced real quickly. Every time Paul uses idios, I don't think he addresses someone in the second person in those contexts, but he's always speaking in the third person. Each one have their own. Each one have their own.
Yeah.
So actually support having a person imperative as a Pauline stylistic feature.
Oh, that's great. Thank you so much for that, Dr. Plummer. Yeah, I'll definitely follow up on that and look into that because that's very significant. Yeah, good. I think the one, if I can raise an objection to my own argument at this point, one thing I'm still wrestling with, and if any of you have ideas, I'd love to hear it, is why the third person, maybe that's the answer there, Dr. Plummer, is given that the other ones are all second person plural, why do we start with a third person here? It's often noted that Paul addresses the subordinate member of these pairings in the household code. He addresses them directly, and that's often used as a kind of illustration of how Paul is radical or different in some way from other household codes in the ancient world. But if I'm right, then at least in the first case, he doesn't address women directly per se, right? I mean, he's certainly still addressing them, but it's in the third person now, not in the second person. So, and maybe you're right, Dr. Plummer, maybe that idios is the explanation there.
Other questions, comments?
Hey, Peter. Thanks for your work on this. This is Nelson Shea. Have you, obviously Dirk Jonkin's going to agree with you because he printed it. But have you spoken to Holder Strutworth or any of the editors of the Density Alon about this and kind of heard what they think? And
No, not yet. I'm hoping the first time they read it is in print. And then I'll ask them what they think. I don't want to be unduly influenced, but yeah, maybe I should reach out to them and see what they think. I suspect there's two things behind their preference. One is P46 and B, which are weighty. And then I suspect, I really think that sixth argument I gave you is by far the one that most people fall back on. And I really do think it's the best argument. Is that how else do you explain the shorter reading? And it was only when I realized that I had just always kind of assumed that the only real alternative to the shorter reading was the second person plural. And then one day in church, I was just reading this text during the sermon, as one does, and noticed that the third person plural seems really awkward in the context, and that it ends with the same letter as the word before it. And that's when all of a sudden I thought, well, then that's the more difficult reading, and it can explain the shorter reading. Up until that point, I was totally on board with the shorter reading as the best explanation for all the others. So I think most people just have not seen that option, either because they've not really even considered the third person as a real alternative, or in some cases, I've had some people, like Pete Head, has objected to my explanation by saying, look, it's only one letter in common. And usually parablepsis of this type occurs with more than one letter in common. And that is true. So that's why one of the things I'm going to hopefully be able to show is all the places in both P46 and B where there seems to be a pretty clear case of omission and there's only one letter shared in common between the words that are involved. So if I can do that, then I can show pretty clear precedent, right? And say, no, it does happen. It may not be the most common, but it does happen, right? So no, I haven't talked to him yet, but maybe I will.
Thanks.
I'm curious how this might intersect with the CBGM in the sense of, it seems like the arguments you've said here are the ones, that most of us are more familiar with, and you're, refuting some of them rightly, but you're still using what would be a more Metzgerian kind of approach to textual criticism. Any comments on development?
Yeah, good question. So the simple answer is we don't have the CBGM yet for Ephesians, so we can't really do a whole lot with it yet. The second thing I would say, though, is the perception that the CBGM is in contrast to traditional approaches. It's really better to think that the CBGM uses traditional approaches and adds more to them. Okay. So now the one exception to that might be on the issue of text types, where the CBGM does not really like text types. Okay. But the CBGM still leverages internal evidence like we always have. It still takes into consideration external evidence, although our opinion of certain manuscripts or manuscript groups has shifted a bit as a result. Okay. But we're still considering external evidence, right, as one piece of the argument. So yeah, the main thing I would love to have the CBGM for in this variant is I think it could help show us which direction the text changed. And if we could show, even 5 manuscripts where it looks like the text changed from the third person plural to the second person plural, that would certainly support my case. If we found a bunch in the opposite direction, then that would be a challenge to my case, right? So yeah, I would like to be able to use the CBGM for this, but I'll probably have to wait a while before I can do that.
That's super helpful clarification. Thank you. Yeah, that's great. Okay. Any other questions, comments?
Yeah, Dr. Gurry, could you so you got the Text and Canon Institute shirt on. You want to just give a plug for what you guys are doing there at Phoenix? And
I'm so glad you asked. I can't see who asked that. But if you email late, your check will be in the mail later. So thank you for that.
I'll email you my address.
Yeah. Email it to John Mead. Okay, John Mead at Phoenix Seminary. So yeah, thanks for asking it. The Text and Canon Institute is something that John Mead and I have started in the last year, and it really was born out of a recognition that we have something kind of special here at Phoenix Seminary in that we have John, who does Old Testament and canon, and has done a lot of detailed work in those areas. And then I, of course, have done work in New Testament text criticism. And so it was kind of as simple as saying, hey, why don't we combine forces and leverage this? And so the Institute itself kind of has 3 pillars. One is we try to provide resources to the church to help them understand essentially how we got the Bible. Why do we have these books and not those books? And what does the text say? And can we trust the transmission? And so we're putting on a Sacred Words conference here in February with Peter Gentry, who I think some of you will know, and Dan Wallace and Stephen Dempster and some others. So that's kind of the church arm. Then the other arm is training the next generation, which means a generous scholarship for our THM program for students who are interested in doing a PhD in issues related to the text or canon of the Bible. And then the third arm is academic work. So this fall, I think I can tell you all, as long as you promise not to tweet about it yet, but we're going to do our first academic colloquium on Origen's Hexapla and bring in about 9 scholars from around the world to give papers on Origen's Hexapla and his role as a grammarian and as a text critic. And so our goal with that is to do a colloquium every 2 years and probably bounce back and forth between New Testament, Old Testament, or canon, and hopefully do some really in-depth work on various issues related to, again, text and canon. Yeah.
Good for you guys.
Yeah. So it's been good. It's been really good. Yeah. If you want to know more, you can go to the website at ps.edu/TCI, and you can sign up for our newsletter there, and that's where we'll kind of have announcements about stuff like the colloquium when it comes out, and you'll see a list there of who's coming and whatnot.
Okay, that's great. Any final questions before we wrap up? Well, thanks for taking time out of your day and to
You're welcome.
It sounds
yeah. Very welcome. Thank you all very much. I appreciate it.
Okay. All right. We'll see you. See you again. Thanks.